With that, straight into our first panel discussion, the ASEAN scene setting. It's my pleasure to hand over to our moderator for our first session, Haslinda Amin, Chief International Correspondent for Southeast Asia, Bloomberg Television, who will be introducing our speakers for this panel discussion and lead us through our whole conversation. Good morning, Haslinda, over to you.
Jenny, good morning from the Lion City, and thank you. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. Please welcome His Excellency Joko Widodo, President of the Republic of Indonesia. Bapak Presiden, please.
Yang mulia para pemimpin ASEAN, Bapak Ibu, para pebisnis di kawasan yang saya hormati. Setelah 20 bulan menghadapi kesulitan besar pandemi COVID-19, saat ini kita melihat harapan baru. Dalam seminggu terakhir ini, kasus COVID-19 di kawasan ASEAN turun 14%. Jauh lebih baik dibanding rata-rata dunia yang turun 1%. Situasi ini dipastikan akan meningkatkan kepercayaan internal dan eksternal ASEAN untuk beraktivitas kembali dan akan mempercepat pemulihan ekonomi. Tetapi tetap menjaga kewaspadaan, mengingat adanya peningkatan kasus di beberapa negara. Dalam menghadapi pandemi sekarang ini, kita tidak hanya ingin pulih kembali, tetapi kita ingin mencuri kesempatan dalam pandemi untuk melakukan reformasi struktural, untuk pertumbuhan ekonomi yang inklusif dan berkelanjutan di kawasan ASEAN. Peluang ini sangat besar untuk bisa kita lakukan. Sebagaimana yang kami lakukan di Indonesia, kesibukan menghadapi pandemi COVID-19 tidak menyurutkan niat Indonesia untuk melakukan reformasi struktural. Indonesia menerbitkan Omnibus Law, Undang-Undang Cipta Kerja untuk memperbaiki iklim investasi dalam rangka mendongkrak pertumbuhan ekonomi inklusif yang menciptakan lapangan kerja. Undang-undang perpajakan juga direvisi dengan tujuan yang sama. Kami ingin terus melanjutkan reformasi struktural ini untuk merespon catatan-catatan kelemahan kelembagaan dan cara kerja kami ketika diuji oleh pandemi COVID-19. Ujian berat berupa pandemi justru kami manfaatkan untuk memperkuat diri dalam menghadapi tantangan masa depan. Saya berharap juga demikian halnya untuk Asia Tenggara. Sebagai kesatuan masyarakat ekonomi, ASEAN merupakan kawasan yang harus mengambil pelajaran dari krisis dan melakukan perbaikan diri secara fundamental di tingkat kawasan. Yang mulia, para pemimpin ASEAN, para pebisnis yang saya hormati, kesamaan visi, semangat, berkolaborasi dan kebersamaan langkah merupakan kunci utama kebangkitan ekonomi ASEAN. Pertama, penanganan kesehatan harus tetap menjadi prioritas pertama. Agenda jangka pendek untuk mempercepat dan memeratakan vaksinasi di semua negara di kawasan harus kita lakukan bersama. Target vaksinasi penduduk ASEAN sebanyak 70% harus segera dicapai secepatnya. Pemerintah dan pelaku bisnis di kawasan harus bersinergi untuk melakukan aksi bersama. Sedangkan ASEAN dalam jangka menengah perlu membangun protokol krisis kesehatan agar kawasan ASEAN lebih tahan menghadapi krisis kesehatan di masa depan. Kedua, pemulihan ekonomi ASEAN harus dipercepat dengan melakukan reaktivasi perjalanan yang aman, termasuk pariwisata yang aman. Menurut catatan UN, WTO, tingkat pembatasan di Asia Tenggara adalah yang tertinggi di dunia, yaitu mencapai 82%. Dengan situasi COVID-19 yang semakin terkendali, pembatasan tersebut bisa dikurangi, mobilitas bisa dilonggarkan, tetapi harus menjamin aman dari resiko pandemi. ASEAN Travel Corridor Arrangement Framework yang digagas Indonesia setahun yang lalu perlu segera diimplementasikan. Pengakuan sertifikat vaksin di kawasan termasuk interoperabilitas sistem vaksin harus segera dilakukan. Pengaturan travel bagi masyarakat yang telah divaksinasi dan sehat negatif COVID harus dibuat. Vaccinated travel lane di kawasan. Jika semua negara ASEAN segera memfasilitasi mobilitas masyarakat dengan aman, roda ekonomi bisa kembali bergerak. Indonesia juga telah membuka secara bertahap Bali untuk safe tourism dengan protokol kesehatan yang ketat. Indonesia membuka Bali setelah tingkat vaksinasi Bali secara penuh telah mencapai 84,8%. Indonesia akan membuka secara bertahap wilayah yang lain yang tingkat vaksinasi penuhnya melebihi 70%. Ketiga, adaptasi kegiatan ekonomi kawasan menuju ekonomi digital harus dipercepat di semua negara. Teknologi digital menjadi solusi yang paling efektif dalam menyiasati keterbatasan pergerakan dan tatap muka dalam kegiatan ekonomi masyarakat. Sebagai kawasan dengan pertumbuhan internet tercepat di dunia, potensi ekonomi digital ASEAN sangat besar. Selama pandemi, ekonomi digital tumbuh mencapai 100 miliar dolar Amerika Serikat di tahun 2020. Hal ini menjadi batu lompatan kemajuan ekonomi di kawasan kita. Indonesia mendukung ASEAN menjadi sebuah digitally connected community. Pemerintah Indonesia juga telah menyusun peta jalan Indonesia digital tahun 2021-2024 sebagai panduan strategis perjalanan transformasi digital Indonesia. Nilai ekonomi digital Indonesia juga sangat menjanjikan, diperkirakan mencapai 124 miliar dolar Amerika Serikat pada tahun 2025, setara dengan 40% total nilai ekonomi digital Asia Tenggara. Saat ini Indonesia memiliki startup sebanyak 2.229, kelima terbesar di dunia. Indonesia juga memiliki 1 dekakorn dan 6 unicorn, dan kami membuka peluang investasi sebesar-besarnya di sektor ekonomi digital di Indonesia. Bapak Ibu sekalian, ekonomi kawasan ASEAN bukan hanya akan pulih kembali, tetapi juga bisa melakukan lompatan kemajuan serta tumbuh bersama secara berkeadilan dan berkelanjutan. Langkah cepat bersama dalam penanganan kesehatan, reaktivasi perjalanan yang aman, serta akselerasi ekonomi digital yang berkeadilan menjadi gerbang bersama untuk pulih bersama dan maju bersama. Terima kasih.
Thank you, President Joko Widodo. Now, as we heard from the President, the pandemic is forcing ASEAN to rethink its priorities, reimagine its future. While no country has been able to escape widespread disruption, ASEAN has, for the most part, been at a disadvantage. Several countries struggled with vaccine access, heightening the economic and political challenges as COVID-19 impacted lives, impacted livelihoods. Add to that, a changing trading and investment landscape, along with geopolitical challenges like Myanmar and persisting U.S.-China relations. So, what are ASEAN's biggest challenges? How can the grouping build back better, ensure a sustainable future without leaving anyone behind? What must it do to continue to attract investment, capitalize on a young, digitally connected and innovative population? Well, I'm very privileged to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Amin Liu Abdullah, Brunei's Minister in the Prime Minister's Office and Minister of Finance and Economy, Chairman of the Brunei Islamic Development Bank. Dr. Lim Jock Hoi, ASEAN Secretary General. Ibu Mari Pangestu, World Bank's Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships. Ibu Mari, as you know, was Indonesia's Trade Minister. Aaron Connolly, Research Fellow, International Institute for Strategic Studies, Rino Donosiputra, Standard Chartered Bank's ASEAN Vice Chairman. Ibu Mari, gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us today. I want to start with geopolitics and the latest on Myanmar. For the first time in ASEAN's history, a non-political representative from Myanmar will be invited to the Leaders Summit this week in a snub to the military, to the Myanmar military. Dato' Lim, your thoughts on what this means for ASEAN? Is there a shift, perhaps, in ASEAN's policy of non-interference?
Yes, we know that ASEAN is closely following the current development in Myanmar, which will have a spillover effect on the region. But ASEAN in April has agreed 5-point consensus by the leaders and reiterated its readiness to assist Myanmar in a positive and peaceful, constructive manner. For the benefit of the Myanmar people, obviously this is very important for ASEAN. ASEAN will continue work constructively with Myanmar to fully implement the 5-point consensus. In the meantime, under the 5-point consensus, we have the point 4, which ASEAN have a responsibility collectively to provide humanitarian assistance to the people of Myanmar, especially during this pandemic. And we are very much progressing in our assistance to Myanmar. And the first batch of the assistance was successfully delivered on the 15th September 2021, which is aimed at supporting a larger COVID-19 response to Myanmar. And subsequently, there will be a couple more assistance to be delivered by the end of November. This is with the help of ASEAN member states as well as the dialogue partner. We have a lot of response, and we will work closely with Myanmar authority in order to deliver this assistance to the needy people in Myanmar as a whole. So it's very important that we stabilize the situation there and work closely with every stakeholder in Myanmar as part of the 5-point consensus.
The thing is, Dr. Lim, there is worsening violence in the country. What else might ASEAN do to hold the junta government accountable for that?
Well, I think it's important that both the Myanmar people and also ASEAN as a whole would like to see them to be more prosperous, more stable, so that the impact of the situation there will not be affecting the whole region. And what is more important is we would like to work closely with them to make sure that the regions is stable and peaceful, and in such a way it will not hold up the ASEAN work program that we have. So we are very helpful, and we want to work together with the people in Myanmar, especially to implement the 5-point consensus that's been agreed by the leaders.
Aaron, let's get your thoughts on this. I mean, this is the most serious sanction against a member nation of ASEAN in its 50 years of diplomacy. How significant is this move? Does it set a precedent?
I think this was, thanks, Hansalinda. I think this was very carefully designed not to set a precedent. The way that the decision was conveyed by Dato' Erdogan and a decision made by His Majesty creates a situation in which this is really a one-off. It applies only to this situation in Myanmar, and it is specifically related to the dispute over the identity of the legitimate government of Myanmar between the SAC, the military, and the NUG, which claims legitimacy based on last year's election. And so I don't think that this precedent, this could be applied to any other situation in ASEAN where you've had a similar situation. That's not really a precedent of a member state having this kind of situation before.
How significant is it, Aaron? And how much of it has to do with pressure from the likes of the US?
I think it's tremendously significant. This is, although the Secretary General is very diplomatic, perhaps, we can speak frankly, this is a small less sanction. It is the most significant sanction that ASEAN has ever handed to a member state. And it is in direct response to the non-compliance that we have seen from the SAC to the 5-point consensus that it agreed to in Jakarta in April. So there's a very significant move, and I think that some analysis that suggests that this is less significant. I think it doesn't put this in the context of ASEAN's history. I would just say, there was an accusation on the part of the SAC that this was due to outside pressure. I don't actually think it was due to outside pressure. There's not a lot of evidence of this. This was a decision that ASEAN member states, the ASEAN 9, made on their own in response to the situations on the ground in Myanmar and the lack of compliance from the SAC.
Were you surprised by the decision?
No, I think this is a kind of natural evolution of the situation that we were seeing with regard to Myanmar and ASEAN earlier in the year, and then also ASEAN's practices. Some said that ASEAN couldn't do this because of consensus-based decision-making or because of the principle of non-interference, but ASEAN did, and I think it's an evolution of the very intensive consultations that we always see in ASEAN as a result of that consensus-based decision-making principle. It took longer than many outsiders would have liked, but it was something that ASEAN was sort of moving towards steadily throughout the year. That's not to take anything away from His Majesty's call. This was a very big call for Brunei to take this decision, but it is something that is consistent with an evolution of past ASEAN practices.
Needless to say, Myanmar's economy is reeling. Its currency, the kyat, is down about 50% since the military took over back in February. Ibu Mari, foreign reserves dangerously low. GDP has contracted almost 20%. What do you think needs to be done to address the situation, to stabilize Myanmar's economy?
Well, I think that's a very difficult question to answer. Obviously, you need to get the political stability back in place before we can think about the economic aspects. But I think it was mentioned that we should address, of course, the humanitarian aspects of the Myanmar people first. And then second, to the extent that you can still conduct economic transactions under the current situation, then we need to keep as much as possible Myanmar being engaged in trade, in investment. But this is probably going to be increasingly difficult until we can resolve the political stability issue, to the extent that you are going to have sanctions, for instance, being imposed by the major markets and so on. So I think the priority would still be the political stability and as much as possible trying to maintain the livelihoods of people. I do think in terms of keeping people's livelihoods going would still be a very important part of safeguarding the people as well as the domestic economy, to the extent that it can still be functioning.
Dr. Amin, let's bring you into this conversation. If Myanmar's economy fails, what do you think will be the impact on ASEAN?
Thank you, Haslinda. I think Myanmar obviously is an important partner of ASEAN as a whole. So we don't want to leave Myanmar behind. So we continue to maintain our ASEAN centrality stance and to encourage them to commit to the 5-point consensus as mentioned by Secretary General earlier on. So that we can bring stability back into ASEAN, and then so we can continue to trade like normal. So, but of course, the pressure on ASEAN and many of our dialogue partners continue to mount if Myanmar do not commit to this 5-point consensus. So, as far as the economy, I think we still continue to trade with them. But as to how long we can continue to do this without further pressures from not within ASEAN, but I think more from outside ASEAN, that is hard to tell. But we hope Myanmar would commit to this this 5-point consensus and come back into this ASEAN centrality. so that we can all continue to work together again. As far as economies is concerned, overall for ASEAN, I think Myanmar, if you look at the economy prior to this crisis, is doing quite well. I mean, but of course, in the bigger scheme of things, we have larger economies in ASEAN, among the ASEAN member states, and so it will affect, just like how COVID-19 has affected all of us. But we do have many other sort of initiatives to try to further our economy, despite whatever internal political situation in Myanmar. There are many other things that we can talk about later on about our sort of effort in our recovery agenda under the Brunei Darussalam chairmanship, and also the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework endorsed by the leaders at the end of last year. And so this set the scenes for our economy to move forward, despite whatever challenges that we are facing with Myanmar.
And Pat Donnie, how does the private sector view developments in Myanmar? Does it add to the risk of doing business in Southeast Asia?
Thank you, Aslinda. And I think very similar to Aaron, actually. We should see ASEAN actually as a collective whole. I mean, it's not something actually that Myanmar's issue is not something actually that, sort of define how ASEAN is being seen or perceived by the global investors. So, first of all, actually, I just would like to share actually the position of ASEAN, the way that we see it in the political economic landscape. It is emerging as really a destination of choice for investments and trade. Large and relatively young population, growing middle class, abundance of natural resources, and strong manufacturing capabilities. It is really at the forefront in capturing the global megatrends of supply chain shift, China +1 strategy, North-South capital investment flow with China's Belt and Road, Taiwan Southbound policy, and the likes. To what Dato' Amin mentioned, actually, the ASEAN sort of numerous free trade agreements, including the RCEP, actually offer global companies wider access to the global markets through a network of free trade agreements actually that have been signed. Everyone increasingly wants a piece of ASEAN, really, actually. And again, actually, for us at Standard Chartered, this is actually the core to our strategy as the only international bank with presence in all the 10 ASEAN markets. We play a role in facilitating global clients, market penetration, and expansion in the region. So the way actually we should look at it, actually, to your question earlier, is that ASEAN is much more actually than just Myanmar. Actually, it is something actually a challenge. And given the diversity, I mean, there's always two sides of the coin, right? ASEAN diversity is the one actually that gives it its strength. At the same time, there are also actually different stages of economic and political development in ASEAN countries.
Aaron, we heard from Pat Donnie saying that ASEAN is more than just Myanmar, but looking at Myanmar and the risks, how high is the risk that Myanmar becomes a failed state, and what can ASEAN do to prevent Myanmar from becoming a failed state?
Well, I think the one aspect of the 5-point consensus that Myanmar has begun to fulfill, as the Secretary General said, is point 4. It's that humanitarian assistance. Myanmar had a very bad COVID crisis earlier this year. It is still ongoing. That humanitarian assistance is very badly needed, and to the extent that Myanmar can fulfill point 4 more comprehensively and with less trouble in the future, I think that would go a long ways to avoiding a failed state scenario. But I think we also have to take soundings and understand that Myanmar, more than any other country in ASEAN, is more of a failed state already. This is a country which the central government has never controlled the periphery of the country at the same level as other ASEAN member states, and where there has always been an extraordinarily level of low economic development. And so the risk of Myanmar going backwards is profound. And I think that's one of the reasons that ASEAN has taken a fairly careful approach to the way that it has handled the Myanmar crisis, because that would have significant consequences for the rest of the region, both in terms of refugee flows, in terms of disease leaving Myanmar, as China and India are very concerned about. So that's certainly a concern.
I want to go on to U.S.-China tensions, which is another geopolitical challenge for Southeast Asia. Continues to place ASEAN in a tug of war, and China's recent show of force over Taiwan is a great cause for concern. Also, the big power rivalry in the South China Sea. Dato' Lim, how do you view rising U.S.-China tensions, the persistent U.S.-China tensions?
Obviously, the political situation is very important. And ASEAN recognizes the important internal and external political dynamics. Indeed, one of the biggest achievements in ASEAN so far is to maintain regional peace and stability, and also to enable the region to cooperate and to flourish. However, I think we are aware that the heightened tension between the major powers, which may exacerbate the recent development in the region, may have an impact on our peace and stability, prosperity. However, ASEAN will continue to engage in the external partners in a constructive manner and will not take sides in the rivalry. As you know, that China is an important trading partner. In fact, the largest trading partner of ASEAN for the last 10 years. And US is also an important partner for ASEAN and the largest investors in ASEAN. If you take cumulatively, the investment to ASEAN is $320 billion and is larger than US investment in India, Japan, Korea, and China together. I think that's how important the two trading partners. And we see these two trading partners should engage in a constructive manner that would take the region to a more cooperative and in a flourish to develop the region and increase ASEAN centrality, which we will maintain the inclusive and outlooking posture to support realization of the community vision. And we hope that these two major trading partners will cooperate, work constructively in this region.
Do you think ASEAN member nations can continue not to pick sides, given what Australia has done? It does seem like it is gravitating towards the US with the recent AUKUS deal.
I think it's we always continue to be neutral in our approach to these two very important partners. We see that it's important for us to work closely with them, and they know that we will not be able to choose either side. We think these are complementary to one another, and we see it is important that we work with them constructively to make sure this region in peace and prosperity, and we're able to work closely, and our market remains open for both sides, and this is good for everyone. And I think this is where ASEAN will be going to in the future and the years to come.
Ibu Mari, what is the best course of action for ASEAN when it comes to trade and investment with both the US and China? How should it position itself?
Well, I think Dato' Lim already mentioned that, what ASEAN should be doing is, of course, remain balanced because both China and the US are very important trading partners and investment partners for ASEAN. And I think what is the key for ASEAN is to continue to deepen and broaden its own regional integration, both within ASEAN as well as RCEP, because then that provides the diversification of trade and investment that will, I think, strengthen ASEAN's position vis-a-vis any external pressures and tensions from the US. So if you notice that even prior to the US-China trade wars in 2018, 2019, there was already diversification outside of China, and they were coming to Southeast Asia. And I think with post-COVID, COVID has led to a disruption of value chains and a rethink about how we should be restructuring regional and global value chains, not just based on efficiency, but also based on resilience, because you have disruptions of the supply chain, including on the intermediate goods side, and then now we have shipping disruptions and so on. So I think increasingly we are regional. I think the prediction is that regional value chains are going to be more evolving, and that's why our role in regional integration will be very key. And I think the second thing that we should advocate as ASEAN, as a region, is to strengthen the multilateral trading system. because what you want to happen is that trade wars don't happen. That if there are issues between U.S. and China, it shouldn't affect us. We are being affected by the spillover of these tensions. They should be settled in the WTO, and with going back to strengthening the dispute settlement system. And if there are disputes about unfair trading, industrial subsidies being one of the big topics, then it should be dealt with in the multilateral system. So that would be also important. The final point I would like to make is that I think the one that I can sort of see where trade and investment could go, but the one that is very, very tricky because it's both economics, geopolitics, and really competition about technology is the whole issue of technology, especially the digital and telecommunications technology, which is in danger of making us a very polarized world in terms of technology. And that's really bad in the sense of you want the technology to be talking to each other, if you like, because if you had a world with bipolar technology systems, then you are really losing out on what I think President Jokowi was saying about the importance of the digital economy. And I think that's a very challenging one. In the past, you would have also dealt with, the way we dealt with how did we get to 4G? There was a lot of multilateral discussions under ITU. There was a lot of disagreements, but then finally there's an agreement on a standard. But we don't see that happening at all for 5G. And in fact, we see a lot of really a lot of tensions and geopolitics around it, and countries being in a way being asked to choose which technology to use. And I think that's a really one of the big challenges that we need to address. And it would be interesting to know how we should position ourselves as ASEAN in that respect.
I'll pick up on the point on technology and digital economy just slightly later. But before that, Aaron, just want your thoughts on this. ASEAN often talks about wanting to engage both the US and China. How can ASEAN help to shape US-China relations? Can it?
I think one of the major contributions that ASEAN has made over the last 15 years, since the inception of the East Asia Summit in the mid-2000s, was to bring the US and China together and to really stitch the diplomatic architecture of the region together. Remember, in the early 2000s, there were conversations about, excluding the United States from the regional architecture, having an ASEAN +3 mechanism with Japan, Korea, and China really leading the regional architecture. And ASEAN took the decision in 2009 to include the United States and Russia, after having taken the decision to also include Australia, India, and New Zealand in 2005. And so that was ASEAN's contribution to the regional architecture. What we're seeing happen now is the regional architecture is beginning to become a little bit more divided. There are sort of centrifugal forces that are beginning to tear away at the regional architecture and at that sort of cohesive geometry that ASEAN created 15 years ago. And the real challenge for ASEAN will be to maintain that centrality amidst great power rivalry that is intensifying. And that'll be up to the leaders, whether or not they're able to do that in the future. I think the decision not to go back to Myanmar, but I think the decision that ASEAN has taken with regard to Myanmar over the last week is really important to reinforcing that centrality, because it means that dialogue partners like the European Union, like the United States, they won't have to think whether or not they really want to come to a summit that is being attended by General Min Aung Hlaing. And so that's really important to maintaining ASEAN centrality and dampening that great power rivalry by getting the big powers at the table.
I'd like to remind our participants that you can submit a question to any of our speakers via the chat. So that would help it be more interactive. So just submit your questions via the chat, okay? Moving over to the economic recovery and policy priorities, ASEAN's economies are starting to recover as they begin to live with COVID rather than be COVID-free. Recovery, though, is looking pretty uneven at this point in time. Dr. Amin, what should be the priorities at the upcoming ASEAN summit to ensure economic recovery and one that is more equal?
Yep. Sure. I think we have seen how our economy has performed in ASEAN in 2020 after such a devastating performance. So when Brunei Darussalam took over the chairmanship, So we were honored to lead the region towards economic recovery. So we focus on a number of things. First is on the recovery, so that we can all build back better and build back stronger. But while we are building back stronger and better, so we also look at how do we actually start, looking at things beyond the immediate recovery efforts. So such as the adoption of digitalization. So we have seen during COVID-19 how this digitalization agenda it's advanced itself in its importance, and also how do we invest sustainably, so so that we build back differently, not just better and stronger, but also how do we build back differently. And so on these three strategic thrusts, recovery, digitalization, sustainability, so we have developed 13 priority economic deliverables. So I'll just touch on a few of them, rather than going through all 13 of them. And under recovery, we obviously have the ASEAN Investment Facilitation Framework. The idea here is to try to continue to attract investment into the region. Back in 2020, we have seen FDI into the region has decreased. But I think that is because of the general global FDI activity. In terms of in terms of our share in the global FDI, it has actually increased in 2020. So although the overall number has decreased, so I think this ASEAN Investment Facilitation Framework is very important to ensure that we have the overall conducive business ecosystem. We need to provide guidance for us to streamline our procedures and all the requirements and so on, so that we can promote the use of a single digital platform for investment and so on. So under digitalization, we do have one of the PEDs, meaning the implementation of the ASEAN Agreement on e-commerce for the next 5 years. So this obviously is the idea is to spur significant growth in the digital economy through regional digital trade integration. In addition to that, we also have a regional action plan on the implementation of the norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. So while we are trying to promote digitalization, we should also be very concerned about the behavior of how people make use of technology. So just to drive home the point of the importance of digitalization, so on top of these 13 PEDs, we threw in the Bandar Seri Begawan roadmap and ASEAN digital transformation agenda to try to accelerate ASEAN's economic recovery and digital economic integration. So I think this BSBR, the Bandar Seri Begawan roadmap, I think it maps out all the steps for ASEAN to advance its digital transformation agenda. So this hopefully will provide a strong foundation for ASEAN's broader digitalization agenda. But on top of that, ASEAN has also finalized the consolidated strategy on Fourth Industrial Revolution. This is a cross-pillar deliverables under Brunei Darussalam's chairmanship. So again, the intention here is obviously to the same thing, progress the digital transformation, embracing new technology in a comprehensive manner. So on sustainability, this is obviously a very important topic, not just about how we, sort of include this in our strategy, but I think it's more to address the current conversation, a lot of movement about environment and so on. So we have the circular economy for ASEAN Economic Community, and we also have ASEAN taxonomy on sustainable finance. And hopefully with all these PEDs, we will give a strong foundation and for our subsequent discussion and for under the Cambodia chairmanship and so on. Thank you,
Dr. Amin, what do you make of ASEAN's digital plan, and what do you think? What should investments be targeting?
Oh, I think so. Obviously, there are plenty of things that we can look at under digitalization. So I think in all, as I said earlier on, digitalization is not just specifically for any particular sector. It's a cross-pillar deliverables. So a lot of industries could make use of technology. I mean, may it be banking, may it be manufacturing. We talk about smart manufacturing and so on. And there is also telecommunication that need to support many of this implementation. So we talk about 5G, for example. So 5G is a technology, but the industry need to embrace it, to adopt it. So if the industries are not coming forward to make use of the technology, then that technology will be useless. So as far as digitalization, it's a cross-pillar, a cross-pillar sort of application from all the industries. So even agriculture, for example, you can adopt technology for smart agriculture and so on. So the application, I think, is unlimited. So to answer your questions.
Pak Doni, how do you think the private sector can play a more significant role in the digital economy in ASEAN?
Haslinda, I think actually this relates to what Dato' Amin actually has just laid out. What are the opportunities actually there? And I think the private sector will see enormous opportunities from ASEAN. I mean, that's very clear, right? I mean, now digitalization, it's something that's really actually quite big, like President Jokowi had highlighted, actually, that it's a great potential for ASEAN, plenty of opportunities actually to invest into. And the private sector can play part actually in many of these sectors. Similar to what Dato' Amin had already highlighted, a number of opportunities. I can think about a few key drivers actually where the private sector would want to move in the digitalization. First is that ASEAN would need significant investments in digital infrastructure. An enhanced focus on new technologies will present these business opportunities. So we talked about the 5G. We talk about ensuring actually that there is an inclusivity actually to people, because there's another flip side of the coin to what Dr. Maria actually had probably touched upon actually with regards to technology actually can also exclude people actually from that particular rural areas where infrastructure for connectivity is actually not really that great, right? Now, another driver is that high digital adoption will drive growth of e-commerce and digital platform services. Now, this in itself, actually, ASEAN is home to close to 20 unicorns. I mean, that has trickle-down effect, actually, to the real sector economy. And on the other hand, actually, it also attracts foreign direct investments in terms of capital into all of these investment firms, into these technology firms. And there are thousands more, actually, of startups, actually, in ASEAN that are really actually at the top list of any global angel investors.
Dr. Ibu Mari, I'm just wondering what you deem as the biggest challenges to ASEAN's digital adoption.
I think the biggest challenge is, like the different systems that are there and how should the systems talk to each other. I mean, to put it very simply. And I do think that there is a few takeaways because of COVID-19. The fact that everybody had to work from home and not having face-to-face, I think has accelerated the use of digital technology across the board, including, the way we are designing the health protocols and so on, and the tracing and testing and containment policies. And I think at least out from the data we have been doing what we call business pulse surveys across many countries, including the ASEAN countries. And what it reveals is that the firms that are able to adopt to digital technology did better in terms of laying off less people and being able to keep up sales. I mean, that's not a surprising finding. But I think what is important is that that leads to the uneven recovery, if you like. The bigger firms, the more established firms, obviously have that better capacity to adapt to these technologies, and there is a big worry that you will have a bigger digital divide, I think, as Pak Doni was. And this is something that I think is a challenge, because I do think that while we talk about the opportunities, the risk of inequality increasing is very high with the COVID-19, because it is the poorer households that are harder hit, the informal sector, the kids who cannot go to school are hitting the poorer household, etc., etc. So the human capital losses side of it is also very big. So I think that's one of the big challenges: how to reduce the asymmetry of information and access to technology for the small and medium-sized enterprises, for the informal sector. And the other sort of finding that we had was that all countries had firm support, had programs to support firms. Only about 20% of firms were reached, because it's very hard to find who are these firms. So I wanted to just say that one of the big challenges, and I think opportunity, is for each of the ASEAN countries, and they are in different stages of it, is to have what we call a digital ID, because that's the foundational block, if you like, for you to have a functioning digital economy. So a digital ID, a foundational digital ID, is basically saying, I am Haslinda. And then you need to link it to layers of other information sources. The citizenship registry. Haslinda is Singaporean. I hope I got that right.
You're right.
And then, okay, she needs social assistance because she falls in the bottom 40%. So you link it to all these. They call this foundational blocks, and it links to the payment system. It links to the mobile system. It links to your ability to be able to build out the digital infrastructure and digital economy platforms that need to happen. And obviously, in the ASEAN context, how do you make those systems be compatible with each other, or be able to be mutually recognized, or whatever the system? Or like, I know that a couple of years ago, the payment system, for instance, that we wanted to have the ASEAN digital e-commerce be able to function on the same payment system. I'm not sure how far we are into that, but these are I think some of the benefits, if you like, of ASEAN. And I would just emphasize what President Jokowi just mentioned about, I think, let me just finish with two quick wins, I think, that where digital and recovery can intersect. What he was saying about the, what was it called? The ASEAN Travel Corridor Framework. I think that's a quick win. 2/3 of ASEAN tourism is intra-ASEAN. I remember that from my tourism minister days. So if you can actually revive intra-ASEAN mobility for tourism and temporary workers with a vaccine passport and testing system, which is what Europe is trying to do, I think you would have a good boost in terms of reviving the economy. Second one would be trade facilitation. I used to call that the costless stimulus. And again, this is where digital technology can play a role to streamline the processing of goods and services moving across the border. You already have ASEAN single window. Make sure ASEAN single window is really, really functioning and reducing the cost of trade between ASEAN and between RCEP, actually. That would be a big boost to trade. We are not even talking about the importance of building more efficient logistics and infrastructure. Let's focus on just those two things that I think is very much in the ASEAN spirit and doable and can be done and can really boost trade and investment and the economy.
Dr. Lim, there's a question here from one of our participants, Mukris Emran. He says, digital adoption is important to strengthen the economy through digital transformation. How does ASEAN collaboratively play an important role in improving connectivity and network infrastructure to all ASEAN countries?
Yes, I know that we have the ACRF, ASEAN Regional Comprehensive Recovery Framework, which concentrate on key 5 areas. One is the strengthen the health system, which is highlighted by President Jokowi, which is critical to our recovery. Second, we have to strengthen our human element, human resources, which is critical again in upgrading and rescaling our people. The third is digital transformation, which is I'm going to answer later on. And the fourth is the external increase our intra-investment into trade within ASEAN and external partners. And finally, a very important one, resilient and sustainable, which is part and parcel of our recovery. I think what is important is interoperability that we have in ASEAN. We have built a network of interoperability in terms of ASEAN single window. As Mari was saying, this is one of the major features of intra-ASEAN cooperation, which helps to reduce the trade transaction costs. And we will extend this to all RCEP countries, including ASEAN Plus World dialogue partners. And this is an exciting area we think that can help us to extend our economic recovery. It means that we will have to focus on the use of the digital economy to ensure there's seamless interoperability, not only in terms of the single window, but also, as Ibu Mari was saying, as we open the economy, we have to make sure they use this technology for safe opening, especially inter-people mobility, which is critical to the economy of ASEAN, especially tourism industry. And we will use this as part of our, the other challenges is for us is how we can maintain this interoperability so that there's no disruption. And we are focusing on the cybersecurity element. We set up the working group on cybersecurity together with the digital economic minister as well as digital minister. We have recently interfaced with the two ministers and we agreed that we will go ahead with our digital transformation, digital roadmap by 2025. We will have a digital agreement among ASEAN member states. But at the same time, we'll make sure that these are being looked after through the cybersecurity network that we built up within the ASEAN system. So digital technology is a key driver for economic growth. We anticipate that this will increase by 300 billion by 2025, and we will add another 1 billion to the GDP of ASEAN member states.
Let's pick up on that. Cybersecurity, data privacy, data on ownership, all big issues for governments around the world. Aaron, what risks do you see given the different standards? And perhaps what regional multilateral agreement approaches are needed?
I think one of the key things that has to happen is the United States has to be at the table. It is one of the big players, and the departure by the Trump administration from TPP, later CPTPP, 4 years ago was a big blow, because if the United States is not at the table and helping to set standards in collaboration with ASEAN, in collaboration with its partners in this region, then of course the standards will be different, and it will be difficult to stitch those things back together. And so, I think that's one of the key questions: is how do you get the great powers, the United States, China, and here we really have to take into account the European Union, which is a regulatory superpower. How do you get them at the same table and make sure that they're on the same page? But as Dato Lim was saying, I wouldn't underestimate the difficulty of this. This is a really challenging work, and it's getting more challenging the greater the tensions between the great powers become.
I want to move on to sustainability. We touched on that slightly earlier, but let's delve deeper. Ibu Mari, at the G20 Trade and Investment Ministers meeting in Italy about 2 weeks ago, your message was pretty clear that trade and investment are the means for a greener, more resilient and inclusive recovery and growth. The question really is, how can ASEAN balance economic growth and sustainability?
Yes, thanks, Hasinda, for that question. I think what we should be looking at is how can we ensure that trade in the recovery can be green, resilient, and inclusive recovery. And it is about, COVID has accentuated the development challenges that countries are facing. And at the same time, you have the climate crisis that you have to deal with. It's already affecting us, put it that way. So you do need to have to deal with it. So how do you respond in an integrated way? And if you look at, let's just look at green resilience and inclusiveness, and how to look at it in an integrated way. When we say green, it's about sustainable trade. And trade has often been blamed for causing CO2 emissions in its production and its shipping costs and so on. But at the same time, trade can also be the solution to sustainable development, to the extent that we can have trade in environmental goods and services, which will help countries also adapt and mitigate, undertake mitigation and adaptation with regard to climate change. You can start with, you can look at the import of weather-resistant seeds, for instance, that will allow countries to then adapt their agriculture, or environmental services and renewable energy, for instance, and so on. So I think opening up trade in environmental goods and services, not just goods, but also services, is one of the key pillars of that. And the other thing that is very, very key is that consumers and markets are increasingly going to demand sustainable supply chains. So it's no longer just about where is the lowest cost of producing something. It is about sustainable supply chains all the way to the source of the input that you're using. So increasingly, investments are being driven by whether or not I can produce something with renewable energy. There's a concrete example of Tesla considering between Indonesia and India, for instance, and asking the question, I will go to where I can produce with renewable energy. So it's not just the actual production of it being sustainable, but how you produce it, and all the way the tracing of the carbon footprint all the way across the supply chain. This is going to be, it is already a reality with the carbon border adjustment mechanism that Europe plans to introduce. So all countries will have to start thinking about carbon pricing as well as carbon tracking the carbon in their production. And I think this will be a challenge for ASEAN to also work together on this. And I think that there's a lot of capacity building that needs to be, we need to make sure that countries have the tools and the infrastructure and the framework to be able to do the tracking and not be punished in a way because they can't meet it and face perhaps a discriminatory trade practices because of it. But we need to keep that as a key issue and make sure that the negotiations in trade and environmental issues involve and include us. And I think this is where ASEAN can really play a role by, having either an ASEAN cooperation around the pricing, the carbon pricing, or the standards that must emerge around the sustainable supply chain. And I just wanted to mention also on inclusiveness, because I do think, we had lots of discussion of this in the G20 Trade Ministers meeting, and I think it's probably also a recurring theme in ASEAN. How do we get the political support for continued trade openness? Because actually, the trade is still good because it leads to growth and poverty, but we also know that trade has not been distributed evenly. So how do we address the inclusiveness part, making sure that SMEs are going to be part of the sustainable supply chain? SMEs are going to not be left out of that digital divide. How do we make sure that we have complementary policies, real effective complementary policies that will actually bring along people as well as the left behind regions, the left behind sectors, the left behind communities. It's partly labor mobility. It's also migration. It's also skills upgrading and just having adaptable social protection policies, I think. And we're actually learning a lot from the COVID social protection policies on that. But, instead of just talking about it, I think, inclusiveness is actually part of the pillars in ASEAN. So we need to, here is where, I think ASEAN can also think about very carefully about how do we make sure that the trade and investment in the recovery is not just going to lead to growth and address poverty, but how does it be more inclusive? That's increasingly going to be an important challenge to meet.
Let's pick up on some of the points that Ibu Mari highlighted. Dr. Lim, will sustainability and ESG investing be an increasing priority for ASEAN, and where are discussions when it comes to carbon pricing? How realistic is it that there will be one soon enough?
Well, we are very conscious of what's going on. We are very conscious about the two issue, development as well as climate crisis or climate change. I've just come out from a meeting of environmental ministers only a couple of days ago. We have a very strong statement to the COVID-26, to COP26, and statement have highlighted many areas that ASEAN is doing. For example, we are doing a lot on the area of marine debris to address this issue. Second, mangrove conservation, peat swamp, peat recovery, which is important for carbon sink. We're also working ourselves on together in fighting against illegal wildlife trafficking, which is critical in our wildlife. And also we are looking at how transboundary haze is affecting each other and trying to reduce it. This is also reducing the deforestation in the ASEAN member state. And obviously important area is energy. We are very progressing in energy efficiency program, which ASEAN has surpassed its aspirational target of achieving 21% of energy intensity. We have already done that. And so we are going to do more on the renewable energy. I think this is a target that ASEAN is going to do in order to address the issue of climate change. And more importantly, as you say, ESG, we are talking about cross-pillar cooperation among ASEAN on the development of ASEAN taxonomy on sustainable finance, which is also very critical. But we have to understand all this issue, especially in order to attract more investment to the country, in order to be able to be sustainable what we produce. So it is critical, but we need more transition period in order to address all those elements, and we need to work together with all partners, especially in the capacity building side as well as technology transfer. We cannot do it without technology transfer, without access to technology, especially in the renewable energy, and that is critical to the future, the climate change. So we will go to COP26 with a strong commitment in the climate change.
And Dr. Amin, we often hear how the private sector has to lead the charge. What do you think businesses can do more for sustainability and be supportive of the SDG goals?
Thank you. Yeah. So I think we talk a lot about sustainability, but I think sustainability is not just about having the right government policies and so on. A lot of these projects on to support sustainability needs to be properly funded. So we are talking about sustainable infrastructure. We can talk about renewable energy. We can talk about marine debris. We can talk about waste management and so on. So even with the right government policy, it needs to be properly funded. So how do we get private sector to come in? And so it all depends also on what the private sector's values on sustainability. So I think in the case of a lot of this will come from the financial institutions. So if you look at speaking on behalf of Bank Islam Brunei Darussalam, BIBD, so our value here is aligned with Maqasid Sharia, which support sustainability. And so along with sustainability, we also champion environmental protection, responsible entrepreneurship, and inclusive social impact, as what Ibu Mari mentioned earlier on. So all of these are important value if we were to be successful in ensuring that our effort on sustainability agenda is achieved. So So maybe if I can just share on what we do in BIBD. So what we are seeing here is plenty of opportunities as far as Brunei Darussalam is concerned, as we do have Brunei Darussalam National Climate Change Committee that look into policies in terms of how do we sort of achieve this low carbon environment and so on. So we feel that there are a lot of opportunity for us to finance this agenda. And so as far as just BIBD is concerned, over the next 10 years, we look at potential of financing of 2 billion Brunei dollars. And so that is a big amount. But again, in terms of the opportunity that we see, we feel that, being the largest financial institution in town, it's our responsibility to kind of lead the way for us to support this agenda. So again, as ASEAN as a region, I think we need to align all our effort together, and in terms of how do we sort of look at financing the sustainability agenda. As I mentioned earlier on, one of the PEDs this year is about ASEAN's taxonomy on sustainable finance. So we need to first of all define what is green actually, right? So before we talk about how do we finance them, so this hopefully create a framework for us to look into what the banks can respond to the work done by ASEAN. And also circular economy and so on. So probably in the interest of time, so these are few of the sort of initiatives this year that set the momentum for the coming years, so that the future chairmanship of ASEAN can continue this discussion and to encourage the private sector to play a bigger role in supporting sustainability agenda. I want to touch a little bit on Ibu Mary's point on inclusivity. So I think during COVID-19, we have seen many sort of people were affected by COVID-19, especially the MSMEs, the women, the vulnerable groups, and so on. So how do we make sure that we also incorporate this inclusivity in our private sector's role to help these individuals? And so we in BIBD, we have many schemes that we look at, but I think without going through all of them, so we just want to sort of share that BIBD, we promote environmental protection, inclusive social impact, and so on. Thank you.
And Donnie, we know that for Standard Chartered, the tagline is here for good. I mean, what are your thoughts? Are you seeing ESG investing as really being here for good?
Thank you, Aslinda. It's a very interesting question. And for us, it's sustainability is really no longer a strategy. It's actually part of our values, essentially. But can I just first actually follow up on what Dr. Mari actually had said about the importance of embracing sustainable supply chain? We did a very recent research called Carbon Data, the Net Zero Supply Chain Revolution. And it revealed that 78% of global MNCs will remove suppliers that endanger their carbon transition plan by 2025. And potential losses to companies not embracing net zero transition in the following markets like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia alone would cost actually about $240 billion. So it is really actually just punctuating further the importance of embracing sustainability principles as fast as possible for ASEAN companies to ensure a more resilient supply chain, and that we can capitalize on the investment opportunities that is happening in the world right now. Now, sustainability really is a big global agenda, as you know, right? It requires trillions of dollars, and I think it's Dr. Amin had highlighted, to come in actually to emerging markets like ASEAN, where we are the most vulnerable to climate change and we need the most funding. However, very often actually that emerging markets are being overlooked and underinvested. Now, we did a study actually last year that interviewing about 300 investment fund managers that has the AUM of 500 trillion or $50 trillion, over actually half of the world's GDP. That 2/3 of their investments currently is still within the developed markets. Having said that, looking ahead, the next 3 years, the focus actually will shift towards sustainable investments in the emerging markets, and where ASEAN is actually at the forefront. Globally, the sustainable debt market, this is the green, social, blue, and sustainability linked bonds reached a cumulative of 1.7 trillion at the end of 2020. So this is actually double the figure, if you will, almost double the figure actually from the last 5 years. Debt instruments such as bonds actually are still dominating with over 70% of sustainable financing. And the volume of ASEAN green bonds and loans jumped to 25.5 billion last year, up from 17.5 in 2019. So despite COVID, actually, it's been quite a good progress when it comes actually to ASEAN. So the region has a positive track record in supporting and innovating solutions that advance this sustainability agenda. Now, as a bank, actually, if we think as more industries actually are moving towards the decarbonization pathways, transition finance is starting to emerge as key and critical theme at Standard Chartered. I mean, we're assisting our clients to transition, providing more funds to climate positive companies and helping carbon intensive firms better manage actually their emissions. We've made commitments to net zero, 2 commitments actually. One is from our operation by 2030 and from our financing by 2050. And in our journey to reach these net zeros, our dual objective is to reduce our own finance emission and help clients to transition. But this is actually where emerging market perspective actually needs to come into place, because we fully understand that different sectors and regions will decarbonize at very different rates. So we're working out actually to map this out actually for the different industry sectors. So for clients who are just starting their journeys, we'll provide sector-specific guidance on what they must do to prepare for a low-carbon future journey. However, those who have probably actually unable or unwilling to meet the requirements, unfortunately, we have to limit our relationship, ultimately leading to an exit, actually, which we have done.
Pak Doni, speaking of green finance, give us a sense of what role green financing is doing in a country like Indonesia that's trying to push the EV sector.
Well, I think President Jokowi has touched upon how important sustainability is for Indonesia, particularly leading up actually to COP26. And from a economic development perspective, I think very similar to what we talk actually, how ASEAN can capitalize on the opportunities. Now, Indonesia has abundant opportunities actually. Actually, EV is one of them, right? I mean, it's the largest sort of consumer market in ASEAN. Of course, actually, it has the largest sort of number of vehicles. Actually, that presents a significant opportunity. The whole end-to-end value chain actually from Indonesia actually has the largest vehicle deposit actually in the world, and EV batteries all the way up actually to the EV vehicles itself and to the whole charging stations that will use renewable energies such as solar power, wind power, and so on actually to generate. That itself actually presents a lucrative billions of dollars actually opportunities for any private sector actually to invest in. And we know that Indonesia also has a lot more friendlier actually FDI policy framework with the omnibus law and 100% ownership actually allowed actually for fintech companies and so on. I mean, this will really actually help to attract it. Last but not least, actually, when you talk about Indonesia, is one thing. As more global companies are adopting net zeros, there's a re-emergence actually of the need actually for doing the offset through carbon trading. Now, carbon credit in Indonesia is, from a potential perspective, it's really actually a natural capital superpower in that regards. Now, we Standard Chartered actually, together with Sdgs, Temasek, and ABIS, actually, we set up the first carbon trading exchange platform in our climate impact exchange in Singapore. We just recently announced that, and that's the first in Asia. But you can see actually that Indonesia can really capitalize actually on that really significant potential from a carbon credit perspective.
Ibu Mari, this question is for you. At least I'm directing it to you. This question is from Oliver Pritchard from ISB. He wants to know, in your opinion, which one of the SDGs is the most important to focus on at this point in time? Tough one.
That's a tough one. Because in a way they are interrelated. But I would say, poverty, our numbers are showing that the numbers that will enter into extreme poverty is going to be like 100 million because of COVID. And it's not unrelated to inequality. So I think poverty and inequality tend to go together, because the higher the inequality, the harder it is also for you to reduce poverty, and it will have an effect on growth, because inequality we also see will be increasing, and it's kind of across the board, whether you're talking about the vulnerable, the lower income groups that are going to be worse off, SMEs and the informal sector who had to sell off their assets and run down their savings, small firms, micro firms, women-owned businesses. The COVID-19 has impacted women more than men in many ways, whether it's income loss or women-owned businesses, or gender-based violence, or lack of health services going to women because of the pandemic, and on many fronts. So I would say those are kind of the big ones, and it's very hard to pick the SDG. But the last thing I would say, what we are seeing is what we call scarring. How do we prevent a lost decade of development that will come from scarring? And the scarring comes from all those human capital losses, basically. That is very hard to reverse once it's lost. Right? Like children not going to school. You have to get them back to school, and then you have to capture the learning losses of not going to school, as well as what they lost from the time they were in school, but they forgot because they were not in school for so long. So and then all the skills losses and the new skills that you have to develop. I really worry about the human capital losses, because those are really hard to reverse in a short time.
We're fast running out of time. I just want to discuss briefly CPTPP. We know that China has expressed interest in joining CPTPP. Aaron, let's have your thoughts on this. What might China's membership mean for the region's security environment? What are the implications?
I'd be very curious as to Dr. Lim's views on this, although he's not in his former role anymore. But I think this is a really interesting bid for membership. Of course, Taiwan has also put in a bid for membership of CPTPP, and I think there can probably only be one China at this particular moment in time in CPTPP. But the real question is whether or not the members will agree to either request, and the easiest thing may be to not agree to either request.
Before I get to Dr. Lim, Aaron, just a follow-up. If China becomes a member before Taiwan and the US, can you envision China vetoing that bid to be part of CPTPP?
Yes.
Okay, Dr. Lim, your thoughts?
Well, there's no secret that they have already applied a long time ago. They expressed the interest to be part of CPTPP. A couple of years ago, they studied the agreement, and I'm not surprised that they apply officially to be part of CPTPP. And we see this a broader Asia-Pacific free trade area that has been moved by China in 2010, I think. This is, we have RCEP with CPTPP with both people in except the US. We hope that they can come in, but this will be a greater Asia-Pacific free trade area that we are talking about in APEC. And this is more or less strategic, but at the same time is bringing everybody together on board to the Asia-Pacific. I think this is a very welcome initiative. Of course, the more people join in as part of the process, I think it's good that we can work together to increase development in the region.
Right. How confident are you, though, that having China as part of CPTPP would bring it closer to CPTPP trading standards, or might it bring CPTPP towards Beijing standards instead?
Well, they have to follow the rule that we have set up during CPTPP. And of course, there will be a lot of transition period, a lot of negotiation. But again, I don't think the standard has to be go down, but it's a matter of how they come in and how they will be able to adopt to the agreement. Of course, market access need to be discussed among member states and a member of the CPTPP. There are a few areas I like SOEs, IP are very critical to the CPTPP. But again, we always welcome. I'm ASEAN Secretary, shouldn't say that, but individually, I think it's a welcome welcome initiative by both of them.
Ibu Mari, your thoughts? Would it be, I guess, imperative for the US to join, to be part of CPTPP if China becomes a member?
You know, these regional agreements should be open. That's the way I have always thought about regional agreements. If we want good regional agreements, so they should be open. But as Dato' Lim said, they have to meet the standards, right? So they should be open. And I mean, this is no secret. When it was designed by the US as TPP, I'm getting all these acronyms. I think there was a statement from the US that it was so that China did not set the rules, which was not very helpful, I would say. You know, because I think the idea of these regional agreements is really to catalyze, you know, and the bigger the members, the larger the number of members, it's better, right? Because you're going towards you know, more and more countries being integrated and having rules and of the trading system that will eventually hopefully become multilateral, right? So that this is the kind of the good side of looking at regional agreements, and that's why I think it should be open, just like RCEP should be open. We would welcome the US to join the RCEP if they wanted to. So I think you know, we always thought about RCEP also as Dato' Lim will be very familiar with this argument that, you know, people tend to compare RCEP with CPTPP as having different standards, but it doesn't mean that RCEP can still evolve and can actually evolve to the higher standards. And CPTPP could probably also learn from RCEP in terms of RCEP, in terms of the capacity building and the economic and technical cooperation, which has been more very much embedded in our side of the agreements and so on. So that's my half full glass view.
In wrapping up the conversation, I'd like to pose a concluding question to all the speakers. What is your top short-term and long-term priority for ASEAN? If you could keep it within perhaps 25 to 30 seconds. And perhaps we can start with Dato' Amin.
I think as we are trying to recover and also to build a better future for ASEAN, all of us, I think, need to adopt, to embrace changes. And so unless we are ready to adopt changes, it's very difficult for us to move forward. Thank you.
For me, I want to see ASEAN to be more resilient, to be more open for investment and trade. And as we become more resilient, we'll be more protected within ourselves. So that's my vision of ASEAN in the future.
Pak Donnie?
I think very similar to Dato' Lim. I think actually ASEAN really has abundance of opportunities, and the main strategic need for ASEAN right now is to optimize regulatory framework, create a conducive investment climate, and increase value propositions to emerge as a leading region in attracting capital investments for the region to recover and grow.
Aaron?
Thanks, Haslinda. I think the challenge is there are 4 really big challenges, and I'm not sure that ASEAN can address all of them at the same time. I don't think there's ever been a period in which the organization has been buffeted by such strong challenges. And it's inequitable growth that Bu Mari has addressed. It's recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. It's addressing the climate transition and addressing great power rivalry. one of those things may have to give. And that's really the challenge, is deciding where to put the priority, where to place the strongest efforts most quickly.
And Ibu Mari.
ASEAN should pursue building back better. What does that mean? It means a green, resilient, and inclusive development pathway. And if ASEAN can do it, it will also contribute to the East Asia region as well as globally.
And on that note, Ibu Mari, Aaron, Dr. Amin, Dr. Lim, Pat Donnie, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an insightful and candid conversation. We appreciate your time. And with that, I'll hand it back to Jenny. Jenny, over to you.
Thank you so much, Haslinda, and your very esteemed panel. It was a very dynamic start to our sessions today. That was our first session, the ASEAN scene setting. So ladies and gentlemen, we're back with our next leader keynote address straight after this message from our BIBD lead partner.
We cleanse ourselves, but at what cost? We brighten up the rooms, only to add to the dark clouds outside. Single-use plastic seems like it will be a part of our lives forever. But what if we told you there are some of us who are spearheading this movement? What if we told you that there are some of us that cradles the earth so we can pass on to the next generation a life? Our partners are those who are responsible in their conduct and enterprise. Learning to harness energy from unlimited sources like the sun. Conscious of how we produce our daily nutrients. A diverse selection of crops grown from well-maintained soil and watered by the rainfalls, collected with the most efficient water management system. Even the clothes we no longer wear could be repurposed and redesigned for an unending cycle of new styles and a new outlook on life. The things we reduce will only add to the change we all strive for. We at BIBD have also taken initiatives to support our government and the community in hopes to sustain a future for all. Protocol Hijau. Sowing seeds, connecting apprentices and masters together. Change today, change the future. Small decisions lead to ambitions larger than life. At home, at work, with the community, we will always be a partner in this journey towards sustainability. Breathing clean, crisp air, endless streams of water, and a mindful life for a more meaningful future.